On the 4th of February, 2025, a group of 14 doctors walked into a press conference in London. They had spent months reviewing every piece of medical evidence from one of the most high-profile criminal trials in British history. Their chairman, a retired neonatologist from Canada named Dr. Shu Lee, looked at the room full of journalists and said something that stopped the country. In summary, ladies and gentlemen, we did not find any murders. The woman those 14 doctors were talking about was already in prison. She had been convicted by a jury of murdering 7 bobbies and attempting to murder 7 others. She was serving 15 whole life sentences. She would never be released. Her name is Lucy Letby. She is 35 years old. She trained as a neonatal nurse and cared for some of the most vulnerable bobbies in Britain. And she is either Britain's most prolific child killer or the victim of one of the most catastrophic miscarriages of justice in modern legal history. After this video, you will understand exactly why both of those things are being argued at the highest levels of British law and medicine right now. This is the full story of the Lucy Letby case. Lucy Letby was born in Hereford, England, in January 1990. She was an only child. By every account given by the people who knew her before the investigation, she was quiet, conscientious, and deeply committed to nursing. She trained at the University of Chester and joined the Countess of Chester Hospital, a mid-sized NHS hospital serving families across Cheshire and North Wales. She specialized in neonatal care, looking after premature bobbies and some of the tiniest, most fragile patients a hospital can have. Parents who passed through that unit spoke warmly of Lucy Letby. They described a nurse who was attentive, remembered names, sent cards, and asked about families after they left. Her defense barrister would later describe her in court as a woman who was hard-working, deeply committed, and loved her work. Nothing suggested what was coming. By 2015, she was an experienced member of the neonatal unit, trusted, competent, and known by many of the families whose bobbies she helped care for. Then, between June 2015 and June 2016, something changed inside that unit. Bobbies who appeared to be recovering began collapsing without explanation. Some were resuscitated, others were not. And the doctors who noticed the pattern would spend months searching for a medical explanation before they arrived at a conclusion they had never wanted to reach. But what exactly did those doctors see? And why did their suspicions eventually turn toward one of their own nurses? That is where the Lucy Letby story truly begins. The Countess of Chester Hospital's neonatal unit was not a simple place to work. Premature bobbies arrive with vulnerabilities that are almost impossible to fully predict. Their lungs, hearts, and immune systems are still developing, and the line between survival and death can sometimes be terrifyingly thin. In that environment, unexpected deterioration is not unusual. But consultant pediatrician Dr. Stephen Breary became increasingly concerned about what he was seeing between 2015 and 2016. Bobbies were collapsing after appearing stable. Some were successfully resuscitated, only to deteriorate again hours later. Doctors began searching for explanations. Could it be infection, equipment failure, problems with staffing or clinical procedures? External specialists were brought in to review the unit, while concerns were raised with hospital management. But the questions did not go away. And then the consultants began looking at something else, the staff rota. They compared the timing of the unexpected collapses and deaths with the nurses who had been caring for the bobbies. One name appeared repeatedly: Lucy Letby. The consultants eventually raised their concerns with hospital management and asked that Letby be removed from frontline neonatal duties. The hospital did not initially accept that there was sufficient evidence of deliberate harm. Instead, further reviews and investigations continued. That disagreement between clinicians and hospital management would later become one of the most important parts of the story. Letby was eventually moved away from frontline neonatal nursing in 2016. Cheshire Police subsequently began investigating the unexplained deaths and collapses. The investigation became known as Operation Hummingbird. In July 2018, Lucy Letby was arrested at her home in Chester. She was later arrested again as the investigation continued, and in November 2020, she was charged with multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. Her trial at Manchester Crown Court began in October 2022. It would last almost 10 months, and the prosecution's case was built around several different types of evidence. The pattern of incidents, medical testimony, clinical records, and evidence recovered from Letby's home. The Crown argued that Letby had deliberately harmed bobbies using several different methods. Among the allegations were that she had injected air into the bloodstream of some bobbies, introduced air into the gastrointestinal system of others, and administered insulin to 2 bobbies. The prosecution also alleged that she had interfered with the care of other infants in ways that caused serious injury or death. These allegations were supported by expert medical evidence presented during the trial. One of the prosecution's principal medical witnesses was retired consultant pediatrician Dr. Dewi Evans, who gave detailed evidence concerning the individual cases. But the medical evidence was only part of the prosecution's case. There was another piece of evidence that would become one of the most discussed parts of the entire trial. A handwritten note found at Letby's home. Written during a period when she was under intense emotional distress, it contained the words, "I am evil, I did this." Another note included the words, "I killed them on purpose because I'm not good enough to care for them." The prosecution argued that these writings were powerful evidence of guilt. The defense offered a very different interpretation. They argued that the notes were not confessions, but expressions of extreme distress written after Letby had been removed from her nursing role and accused of harming bobbies. They pointed to the circumstances in which the notes had been written and argued that the words reflected self-blame, despair, and psychological turmoil. The jury had to decide which interpretation was more convincing. There was also evidence concerning Letby's personal records and online activity. Prosecutors highlighted diary entries and Facebook searches involving the families of bobbies who had died. They argued that this behavior was consistent with someone who was unusually interested in the aftermath of the deaths. The defense rejected that interpretation. They argued that a nurse who had cared deeply for critically ill bobbies could naturally remain interested in their families and struggle emotionally after their deaths. Then Letby herself took the witness stand. She told the court that she had always wanted to work with children and described the accusations against her as devastating. She denied deliberately harming any baby. The defense also suggested that senior doctors had focused on Letby because they were attempting to divert attention from problems within the neonatal unit itself. Among the issues raised were staffing pressures and concerns about the hospital's systems and working environment. The jury ultimately rejected Letby's account. On the 18th of August 2023, she was convicted of murdering 7 bobbies and attempting to murder 6 others. The jury was unable to reach verdicts on some of the remaining charges. She was sentenced to multiple whole life orders. She has continued to maintain her innocence. But the verdict did not end the story. Because while the courtroom had reached its conclusion, a completely different debate was beginning outside it. Was the medical evidence as strong as the jury had been told? And could the deaths have had explanations that the trial had failed to properly consider. Those questions would eventually bring doctors, statisticians, and legal experts back to the case, and put the evidence itself under an entirely new microscope. While Lucy Letby sits in prison, another story has been unfolding in the background. A story about the hospital management who were warned, and what happened after those warnings. Dr. Stephen Breary first raised concerns about Letby in October 2015. He and his fellow consultants repeatedly asked for Letby to be removed from frontline duties as concerns about the unexplained collapses grew. Each time, hospital management did not accept that there was sufficient evidence of deliberate harm. Instead, the consultants were called into meetings with the hospital's chief executive, Tony Chambers, and medical director, Ian Harvey. According to evidence later examined by the Thirlwall Inquiry, the consultants were asked to apologize to Lucy Letby after raising concerns about her. The consultants refused. Management continued to consider alternative medical explanations for the unusual pattern of deaths and collapses. External reviews were also undertaken, and the hospital did not initially conclude that deliberate harm had occurred. And all the while, bobbies continued to collapse in the neonatal unit. When Letby was finally removed from frontline neonatal duties in 2016, the pattern of unexpected collapses changed dramatically. For the consultants who had raised the alarm, that was deeply significant. But whether Letby's removal itself proves that she caused the earlier collapses is a separate question, and one that remains central to the debate surrounding the case. The government established the Thirlwall Inquiry in September 2023, chaired by Lady Justice Thirlwall. Its purpose was not to decide whether Lucy Letby was guilty. That question had already been decided by a jury. Instead, the inquiry was established to examine the wider circumstances surrounding the deaths and collapses, including how the hospital responded to concerns raised by its clinicians. Why did senior doctors raise concerns? How did hospital management respond? And could more effective action have prevented further harm? Those questions became even more significant as the inquiry examined the hospital's leadership and decision-making. Then, in July 2025, 3 former senior leaders at the Countess of Chester Hospital were arrested on suspicion of gross negligence manslaughter. Police said the investigation concerned potential grossly negligent action or inaction by individuals in senior roles, particularly decisions made in response to increased infant fatalities. But an arrest is not a charge or a conviction. The 3 individuals have not been charged and remain entitled to the presumption of innocence. The investigation, therefore, remains a separate matter from Lucy Letby's convictions. But the management story does not end there. Lawyers representing former hospital leaders, including Tony Chambers, Ian Harvey, Allison Kelly, and Sue Hodkinson, sought to have the Thirlwall Inquiry suspended after concerns were raised about the emerging medical evidence surrounding the Letby case. Lady Justice Thirlwall rejected the request, and the inquiry continued. Meanwhile, another group of experts was examining something very different: the medical evidence itself. And on the 4th of February, 2025, 14 doctors and other medical specialists gathered in London. They had spent months reviewing medical evidence relating to the cases at the center of the Letby trial. Among them was Dr. Shu Lee, a retired Canadian neonatologist whose earlier academic work on neonatal air embolism had been discussed during the trial. Then he delivered a conclusion that immediately reignited the controversy. Our conclusion was there was no medical evidence to support malfeasance causing injury in any of the 17 cases in the trial. The panel went further, arguing that the deaths and injuries could be explained by natural causes or poor medical care rather than deliberate harm. Then Dr. Lee delivered the sentence that would dominate headlines around the world. In summary, ladies and gentlemen, we did not find any murders. For supporters of Lucy Letby's convictions, that conclusion was deeply controversial. For her supporters, it represented something entirely different, a challenge to the medical foundation of the prosecution's case. But there was a crucial question. Who exactly were these experts? What evidence had they reviewed? And when they examined the 17 cases one by one, what did they actually find? That is where this story takes its most dramatic turn. As of August 2026, the Thirlwall Inquiry's final report has not yet been published. In its latest official update, the inquiry said the report would be published at the earliest practical date, but not until after Parliament's summer recess. No specific publication date has been announced. And that means the final chapter of the hospital management story is still being written. The Bobbies, the prosecution said, had died from injected air. The international panel said it found no medical evidence supporting the theory that air had been deliberately injected. Instead, the panel argued that the Bobbies had serious underlying respiratory conditions, including chronic lung disease and respiratory distress syndrome, which could explain their deterioration. The Bobbies allegedly poisoned with insulin. The panel challenged the interpretation of the insulin evidence and argued that the findings did not establish deliberate poisoning, and the baby allegedly harmed with excessive milk. The panel argued that the deterioration was better explained by medical mismanagement involving a tension pneumothorax, air trapped between the lung and chest wall. According to the panel's interpretation, that condition required urgent treatment. The panel went further. Its members raised serious concerns about the standard of neonatal care at the Countess of Chester Hospital. They argued that some of the Bobbies had received inadequate management of serious neonatal conditions. Dr. Shu Lee went further still, comparing the standard of care with what he said would have resulted in a hospital being shut down in Canada. But there was another voice that needed to be heard. Lucy Letby's defense barrister, Mark MacDonald, argued that the case lacked the kind of direct evidence normally associated with a murder conviction. He pointed to the absence of forensic evidence directly linking Letby to deliberate harm, the absence of CCTV footage showing an attack, and the absence of an eyewitness who had seen her deliberately injure a baby. MacDonald told the court, "There's no forensic evidence. There's no CCTV. There's no eyewitness evidence." He also made a striking admission. "I'm not naive. I've represented many people over the years who are guilty. But I'm also able to see very clearly where this has gone wrong. There is one more detail about the expert evidence at the original trial that deserves careful attention. The prosecution's leading expert witness, Dr. Dewi Evans, relied in part on research concerning neonatal air embolism when presenting the prosecution's theory about injected air. That research was associated with Dr. Shu Lee and his colleagues. But Lee himself did not testify at Letby's trial. He later said that he became aware of how his research had been used in the case only after the trial. That discovery became one of the reasons he became involved in the subsequent review of the medical evidence. And that review eventually led to the international panel that gathered in London on the 4th of February, 2025. Their conclusion was extraordinary. We did not find any murders. But there was a problem. The international panel had reached a dramatically different interpretation of the medical evidence from the one presented to the jury. So which side had got it right? And more importantly, Could the medical evidence actually prove what happened to those bobbies? That question takes us to the heart of the controversy surrounding Lucy Letby's convictions. The Criminal Cases Review Commission, the body that investigates potential miscarriages of justice in England and Wales, is currently reviewing Lucy Letby's convictions. The CCRC received a preliminary application on her behalf in February 2025. Additional evidence and expert reports were submitted throughout 2025 and into 2026. As of February 2026, the CCRC confirmed that its review was underway. If the CCRC finds sufficient grounds, it can refer the case back to the Court of Appeal. That could potentially result in the convictions being quashed, or the case could be sent back for a retrial. But the CCRC itself does not decide whether Lucy Letby is innocent or guilty. That remains a matter for the courts, and the process takes time, but it is underway. This case presents one of the most difficult questions in British criminal justice, and it needs to be stated honestly. A jury sat through almost 10 months of evidence. They heard the prosecution case and the defense case in full. They considered the medical evidence, the clinical records, the witness testimony, the handwritten notes, and the other evidence presented during the trial. They deliberated, and they returned guilty verdicts. Letby's subsequent attempts to challenge her convictions at the Court of Appeal have so far been unsuccessful. The families of the bobbies who died in that unit have maintained that justice has been done, and their lawyers have strongly challenged the conclusions of the international expert panel. In submissions to the Thirlwall inquiry, lawyers representing several of the families described the panel's analysis as containing analytical holes and argued that it substantially reworked arguments that had already been rejected at trial. Those families deserve to have their position heard clearly, because they are not simply watching a legal argument from a distance. They are living with the deaths and injuries at the center of this case. And at the same time, 14 international medical experts publicly concluded that they found no medical evidence of murder in the 17 cases they reviewed. Dr. Shu Li, who chaired that panel, has argued that the medical evidence used against Letby was fundamentally misinterpreted. 3 former senior hospital leaders were also arrested in July 2025 on suspicion of gross negligence manslaughter. They have not been charged and remain entitled to the presumption of innocence. And the government's Thirlwall inquiry has been examining what happened inside the hospital, including how concerns raised by consultants were handled. So there are now several separate processes examining different parts of the same story. The criminal convictions, the medical evidence, the hospital's management, and the possibility of a miscarriage of justice. And somewhere inside HMP Peterborough, Lucy Letby remains in prison. She has always denied murdering or deliberately harming the bobbies involved. Her CCRC application remains under review. And as of August 2026, the Thirlwall inquiry's final report has still not been published. In its latest official update, the inquiry said the report would be published at the earliest practical date, but not until after Parliament's summer recess. No specific publication date has been announced. The question of whether Lucy Letby is Britain's most prolific child killer, or whether her convictions represent a catastrophic miscarriage of justice, has not been finally resolved by the current review process. What is certain is that this story is not over. But before anything else, there are bobbies who need to be remembered. 7 bobbies died at the Countess of Chester Hospital's neonatal unit between June 2015 and June 2016, in the cases for which Letby was ultimately convicted of murder. Their identities were protected throughout the trial. They were known publicly only by letters: Baby A, Baby B, Baby C, Baby D, Baby E, Baby F, Baby G. Some of them had barely opened their eyes. Some had names their parents had chosen weeks before they arrived. Some never made it out of that unit. Their families have lived with that loss for years. Whatever this case ultimately concludes, whatever the CCRC decides, whatever the courts eventually rule, those losses are permanent. 7 other Bobbies survived incidents for which Letby was ultimately convicted of attempted murder. One of those children was left severely disabled. Their families have also lived with consequences that cannot simply be undone by a verdict. And that is perhaps the hardest part of this entire story. Behind the legal arguments are 14 families whose lives were changed forever. Some believe justice has been done. Others have faced years of uncertainty and unanswered questions. But all of them are living with something no family should ever have to carry. Whether those deaths and injuries were caused by deliberate criminal acts, by failures in medical care, or by some combination of factors, is now being examined through legal and investigative processes that remain ongoing. And that answer matters, not just for Lucy Letby, not just for the hospital and its former leaders, but for the families who deserve to know, as clearly as possible, what happened to their children inside that unit. This is one of the most consequential criminal cases in modern British history. And it is not over. If you want to follow every major development as it happens, subscribe and hit the bell. Because when the CCRC reaches its decision, when the Thirlwall Inquiry publishes its final report, or when there are further legal developments involving the former hospital executives, we will cover them here. And now I want to hear from you. After watching the entire story, what do you think? Was the original prosecution right? Has the medical evidence now raised serious enough questions to justify another look? Or do you believe the jury got it right? Tell me what you think in the comments. Because this is a case where the evidence, the law, and the medical science are now colliding in an extraordinary way. We did not find any murders, 4 words, 14 experts, and a criminal conviction that remains in force. The final answer is still not here.